And there's probably no one better positioned to help us address that question than today's speaker, who is Professor John Skrentny from the University of California, San Diego. Professor Skrentny is with the Department of Sociology there. He's also newly appointed as the director of the Yankelovich Center. Is that correct?
Yankelovich.
Yankelovich, wrong accent. Which is currently focusing on issues of upward mobility in the United States and the factors that determine or limit that. Professor Skrentny got his BA from Indiana University and his PhD in sociology from Harvard. He's the author of at least 3 books, most of them focusing on civil rights and issues of race and opportunity. He's now, as you can imagine, is now beginning to shift some of his interest towards the science of science and innovation development. So we're very pleased to have him here today to talk with us about his topic, Is There a STEM Workforce Crisis? Professor Skrentny.
All right, thanks, Richard. Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak to a bunch of people who are eating. I like it. I feel like I'm the television in your living room, but you can't change the channel. You're pretty much stuck with me. It happens in my classes at UC San Diego. Are there any UC San Diego students here? All right, all right. I was teaching in a large lecture at UC San Diego once, and there was a student sitting in the second row who was knitting while I lectured. It was the oddest feeling. She listened intently, but she put a sweater together while I spoke. But you guys are going to be busy with your meals, and I'm going to walk you through this research that I've been doing for the past few years, finishing up a book on it this summer. And as Richard said, I'd spent years trying to understand policies related to equal opportunity, trying to understand discrimination laws, how to provide equal opportunity for existing jobs. Recently, I moved to the question of how are there going to be enough jobs for everyone? And one of the things that I've learned throughout this process is that, I'm going to go back and forth to the different rooms here, is that there's a lot of folks who believe that STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and STEM workers are the keys to job creation, how we're going to have enough jobs for everybody. So that's what we're going to be talking about. It's a lot of substance, and I've got like 40 minutes or 35 minutes here, a lot of substance, not many jokes, a few anecdotes. I assure you I'm hilarious in interpersonal conversation, but this talk is going to be a lot of substance. And so let's get started. And a little bit of autobiographical note here. I got interested in this topic when I was at a conference in Brussels, a conference called the Brussels Forum. It was 2011. And it was an interesting conference, not the kind that professors usually go to. There were a lot of policymakers, a handful of academics, but a lot of policymakers as well. This is Senator Mark Warner. Some of you may recognize him. He's been in the news a lot lately. Senator from Virginia. And he was on a panel along with Richard Fisher, who was the head of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. They were on a panel with 2 other folks talking about job creation. And it was 2011. We were still in the Great Recession. And these guys were talking about, well, how are we going to get enough jobs for everyone? And one of the things that they talked about was innovation. And so this is the line that really stuck with me. It turned out that the whole conference was on YouTube, and I was able to put this together here. So let's see here. How do you do this on? Oops, I'm left-handed, so everything's backwards.
I would also add, and just to stir the conversation a bit, I think we also need to recognize as we think about innovation, I would make the premise that for the last decade, for the most part in the world, we didn't see much real innovation the way we saw in the 90s. My background was in technology beforehand and in telecom. The one exception, of course, being social networking and social media, which has played an enormously important role recently in the events in North Africa. But the only place we really saw innovation was in the financial markets.
Right.
And we could use a few more real engineers and a few less financial engineers, I think, in the next decade. And I hope we can touch on some of them.
Okay. Yeah, well, I definitely want.
So unfortunately, the talked over his applause line, which he gave at other speeches. We need more real engineers, not financial engineers. That's going to be the secret to innovation and creating jobs for the future. Now, one of the ideas that came out in this presentation, this is Richard Fisher, was this idea basically that you hear a lot in the policy discourse about job creation and STEM innovation. The more STEM workers we have, the better it's going to be. This idea was so obvious that after Richard Fisher talks about it, Senator Mark Warner is going to say it's basically the ultimate no-brainer that we want to attract, in this case, skilled immigrants. And just as an aside, this was this defining moment in my academic career, and amazingly, the camera panned over to me. And so you can see me furiously writing notes while this is all happening. So I never thought in 6 years I'd be talking to all you guys about it. But so this is Richard Fisher and explaining what is so obvious to him.
To take some more questions, but sticking with the topic of education and competitiveness for a moment. Richard, you raised an interesting point about how the Chinese are getting in this game. And in fact, many countries, particularly in the emerging markets, are actually paying the top grads to come back and start companies at home now. We haven't talked too much about jobs and immigration policy, and I'm wondering if anyone would like to step into those waters and talk a little bit about what you think should be done on that front.
Can I take a stab?
Please.
Mainly because it's not my responsibility.
Always a safe one.
We think often of immigration policy in the United States as Mexicans streaming across the border, leaf blowers, low value added, et cetera. We have still, to this day, the most prominent universities in the world. Everybody comes to America to be educated. How do you finance education? You either do it through taxes if you're a state university, revenues of the people, or through endowments and giving if you're a private university. To me, one of the most ridiculous parts about our immigration policy is we bring people to America. They're educated in our institutions. They are subsidized by the taxpayer or by these private givers because tuition doesn't cover the cost. We graduate them, and then we say, go home. We don't let them stay. That's an absurd immigration policy, and it's very counterproductive from an economic standpoint. If we're going to give them the tools, why don't we let them use those tools where we educate them and keep them?
Senator,
so I think we're going to have to figure out a way to do that from an economic standpoint. I know the politics are difficult when we have so many people unemployed in the United States, but in the high value-added areas, we're providing the educational base to propel that side of the economy.
Senator Warner, do you think that we should be stapling green cards to
Absolutely. I mean, this is kind of the
PhD candidates?
No-brainer.
Right.
And if you look across the kind of where some of the greatest entrepreneurial successes in the last 30 years in America have been, they've been first-generation Americans.
Particularly in Silicon Valley.
Particularly in Northern Virginia and Austin, Texas, and elsewhere as well. But
okay, so basically what we're hearing from these policy experts, and I want to specify this, there's two aspects to this STEM crisis, and I'll make the case that a lot of people perceive it as a crisis in a moment. One is that there's not enough people with STEM degrees to be entrepreneurs, to be innovators, to make things happen. And then second, there's not enough people with STEM degrees to be workers for those firms. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, I'm going to make the case here over the next few slides that there's a wide perception that there is this crisis, that there's not enough STEM workers in the United States. This is the cover of a report that was done by the National Academy of Sciences called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, Energizing and Employing America to a Brighter Economic Future. Major takeaway point there was that that we need more of these STEM workers for their innovation. Here's a key point that this ended with. It says, while only 4% of the nation's workforce is composed of scientists and engineers, this group disproportionately creates jobs for the other 96%. So these STEM workers are going to save us. That is the argument. That report came out in 2005. A few years later, there was a sequel, Rising Above the Gathering Storm Revisited, rapidly approaching Category 5, dramatizing this sense of crisis that there aren't enough STEM workers. We're not getting enough innovation for job creation. So it's not just innovation and entrepreneurship we're talking about. We're talking about finding workers to fill these positions. And this is Bill Gates. He's regularly going to Congress and lobbying for ways to increase the number of STEM workers, generally through immigration, through H-1B visas, optional practical training that allows foreign students to stay here and work. And he's made this argument again and again that U.S. companies face a severe shortfall. There's a shortage of scientists and engineers in general. President Obama was very much a part of this argument as well. His Council of Advisors on Science and Technology put together a plan to produce 1 million additional, that means 1 million additional STEM workers would normally be graduating from the nation's universities in science, technology, engineering, and medicine. The word STEM somehow catalyzes all, it attracts all this attention. A graduate student at UC San Diego, Natalie Novik, put this together. She went through she went through Congress and eliminating, bills about stem cell research and focusing on STEM the way we're talking about it. You can see this rise in the number of bills that mention STEM. It's becoming increasingly popular to legislate in this area. And then there's kind of a STEM pipeline industry. And by that I mean there's all these kinds of organizations that are working on the problem of getting us more STEM workers. There's this idea that we have 4 million ninth graders, 2.8 million high school graduates, so fewer people graduate from high school. Only 1.9 million have college plans. Only 1.3 million are college ready. Only 278,000 major in STEM. And then at the end of the pipeline, tiny little trickle, we only have 167,000 STEM graduates. Again, creating the sense we don't have enough, we need more. The puzzle is when you look at the data, there's some strange things here. It's a little puzzling to look at this and square the notion of a crisis with some key facts. And this is the really key fact, and this is something that after going to that conference in Brussels, learning more about it, really got me interested in studying this stuff. There's 10 million Americans with STEM degrees, but according to the NSF, the National Science Foundation, only 5 million work in STEM jobs. So if there's such a shortage, what are all these other folks doing? What's going on here? And it's not just the older folks. 45%, according to research by Hal Salzman and Lowell, they find 45% of new STEM grads work in STEM jobs, and these are the new ones. Okay, so we're not talking about people moving into something else. Right out of the bat, so we could add to that pipeline thing. Even fewer go into these jobs. For some reason, they're choosing not to work, or if they're not choosing, they're not being able to find jobs. So we don't know what's going on there. And actually, only about 30% of STEM workers are actually involved in research and development in that job-creating innovation. And finally, no one actually knows what STEM is. We know what the acronyms mean, but what exactly does that mean? So throughout the rest of the presentation here, I'm going to tell you 5 stories. 5 stories to understand why there's this perception of a crisis. And one of them has to do with the more the better model. Another one has to do with what I'm calling a STEM-ification of the nation's labor markets. And then 3 different stories about how I think the private sector is kind of causing the problem themselves, and that we need to identify that and see what we could do to improve that situation. The big takeaway that I want you to leave with is to be skeptical. When you hear people talking about this STEM crisis and we need more the better, skeptical of that. Because if you look closely, there's a lot more complex, important, and interesting stuff going on. So let's start here with the story number 1, the more the better, TMTB for short. And the idea here is that if we understand STEM employment in the United States in the more the better way, it'll never be satisfied. It's going to be a permanent crisis. And let me explain what I mean by that. So a big part of the story is that going back to the Cold War with national security arguments and moving to more recent decades, really starting in the 80s, talking about economic growth and economic competitiveness, policymakers, legislators have been making arguments, the more STEM workers, the better it is for the United States. I'll give you some examples of that in a second. So they literally keep track of the numbers, and they say, this number is too low, we need more. And the key point I want you to leave with is they don't say how many we need, so it ends up being this kind of the more the better sort of argument. Kind of heard this from Richard Fisher. I think a lot of folks tell anecdotes of this tradition of immigrant entrepreneurs. great part of the American story. One of the founders of Google, founder of Yahoo, there's founder of Intel. There's all these great stories of immigrant entrepreneurs. But when policymakers make these arguments, they're kind of making the more the better argument. The more immigrants we let in, the more skills, the greater the chances that they will be innovators and entrepreneurs. In economics, there's this idea of research and development spillovers. And this basically means that when you get a bunch of smart people together innovating, you get these kind of spillovers where different ideas sort of spin off, like liquid spilling out of a bowl or sparks coming off of a sparkler or something, that generate other ideas. It ends up being the more the better argument, because the more these folks you get together, the more the positive, beneficial spillovers you're going to get. In economics, there's this idea of agglomeration. And this is the idea that if you bring a bunch of smart people together, just by agglomerating all these folks, it's going to create economic benefits. UC Berkeley economist Enrico Moretti makes this argument. He looks at Silicon Valley, and what you see there is this kind of cycle where you get a bunch of smart people together, that attracts more smart people, more innovation happens because they're bouncing off of each other. They end up creating jobs, which create jobs for laundromats and sandwich makers and all kinds of folks who need to support the folks working in these innovative industries. But again, it ends up being a more the better argument. What's the limit for this? Again, it's sort of the sense of a permanent crisis that we don't have enough. Now, here's an example of this. This is Senator Edward Kennedy. This is back when the United States was really, really concerned about competition from Japan. Everyone was concerned that economic, technological growth coming from Japan was basically leaving the United States behind. And he used this the more the better kind of logic, this kind of benchmark. The Japanese now have doubled the number of engineering graduates in the last 10 years. We've held level. So the idea is we need to have more. If we have more than them, the better it is going to be for us. And again, this linkage to jobs. This is more recent. This is in a op-ed that was in the Wall Street Journal. Steve Case, the founder of AOL, he's talking about policies to attract skilled migrants to the United States. Congress dawdles, the world steals our talent. These folks come and they start companies that create jobs. I think this is correct. What I'm pointing out is this notion that the subtext of this, or the assumption of this argument, is that the more of these folks we have, the better, and so we have this permanent perception of crisis. All right, story number 2. Maybe this is something that some of you in your work lives have realized. And this is the idea that jobs in general are becoming STEM-ified. They're becoming more technical. And this seems to create a crisis. And I think this is one of the strongest arguments for the perception of a crisis. Jobs are increasingly becoming technical, requiring STEM skills. I'll give you an example. Anyone who enjoys animation, if you look at old cartoons, they were made by people drawing pictures and then taking photos of those and then drawing a slightly different picture, and that's how animation occurred. Now animation happens on laptops and computers, and it's all digital, and it's become a technical job. Marketing used to be, people like the show Mad Men dreaming up ideas and coming up with commercials and magazine advertisements. Now marketing is very much about algorithms and targeting and getting people to click ads, right? Jobs are becoming more technical. And you can see that those with STEM degrees have lower unemployment rates than those who don't have STEM degrees. There seems to be a demand. They seem to have an easier time getting jobs, and this fits the notion of kind of STEM-ification of labor markets. So what the evidence seems to show then is that, and Anthony Carnevale, an economist at Georgetown University, has made this argument very persuasively, that on one hand, it looks like there's an oversupply of STEM degree holders. There's 5 million who don't have a STEM job. But I think that kind of comes from a misunderstanding of what actually is a STEM job and how STEM skills are valued throughout labor markets. So let's talk a little bit about why we can make this argument. Does anyone know who this person is? You probably don't. Though she's central to this entire presentation, this is the person who came up with the STEM acronym. Her name's, and her great contribution was to rearrange some letters. The National Science Foundation was using a different acronym, not quite as pleasing to the ear, Sounds like the sound that it might make if you smash a bug on the wall or something. It actually made a lot of sense. SMET meant engineering and technology are based on science and math. So it had this kind of logic to it. She rearranged it and called it STEM, and then you saw this explosion of bills in Congress. So her name's Judith Romilly. She's now the president of a university. She was working then for the National Science Foundation. That was only in 2001. I was surprised how new this term is. It just really moved its way into the lexicon, and people use it all the time. She's the one who suggested changing SMET to STEM at a conference, and boy, did that take off. Sort of crystallizes this focus. Now everyone can kind of talk about this thing, and everyone seems to understand what they're talking about, and you see this rapid increase. The problem is everyone's using this phrase STEM without really defining what the heck that means. And I want to make the case that STEM is really ambiguous. And if you sit down and, we have this general understanding of it, but if you ask people, well, is this STEM, is that STEM, it's really hard to understand. And I'm going to make the argument that there's a vertical ambiguity, and by that I mean, you can think of education as having PhDs, masters, bachelor's, associate's degrees, high school, sub-high school, kind of a vertical organization of education. STEM is ambiguous on, how much education do you need for it to really be a STEM job? And then a horizontal ambiguity, and that is the different types of jobs out there. Which ones do we consider to be STEM, and which ones do we not consider to be STEM? I had a little fun with Google. This looks really STEM-y. Doesn't that look extremely STEM-y? This was a Google image search for mechanical engineering. That looks really STEM-y. There's all this technical stuff going on. Not STEM-y at all, though. Auto mechanic. Auto mechanics now are incredibly technically skilled people. They use technology. Generally, when we're talking about STEM shortages, we're not talking about auto mechanics, right? So there's an ambiguity there. Why don't we include those folks? Here's another example. This is a Google image for chemical engineering. Definitely STEM, no doubt about it. I'm always shocked that everyone knows what this is. Does anyone know what this is? Everyone knows it. There's a lot of beer drinkers around here. I live in San Diego. We're kind of working for the Chamber of Commerce now. Come and have our IPAs. They're really good. Actually, the San Diego brewing industry hires PhD scientists, understanding yeast and hops and how all this stuff works together. But generally, we don't consider brewer to be a STEM job. Why not? It looks pretty technical, right? So that's what I mean by the horizontal ambiguity. And that point I made about marketing and animators and that sort of stuff. So if you look in the government, and I looked really hard for an official list of STEM degrees, I was able to find one. It's actually from the Department of Homeland Security. They have an official list of STEM degrees for what they call their optional practical training program. I mentioned this before. This allows foreign students, international students, to work in the United States legally for a year after they graduate. But after the lobbying of Bill Gates and some others, they extended that time limit for STEM graduates. They can now work for an additional 2 years. So they can work for 3 years total in the United States. So the United States, following Richard Fisher's argument, benefits from the talent that and the skills that they learned in the United States. But to give those folks an extra 2 years, they had to decide exactly what is a STEM degree. This is what I just said, 3 years total for STEM degrees. And if you look at the list, it's constantly expanding. And they're adding a lot of things that you might not normally think of as STEM. They're really struggling with these vertical and horizontal ambiguities that I was just talking about. So one of the things that they include, or some of the things they include in STEM are livestock management, important, technical, but probably not the job-creating innovation sort of degree that we're talking about. Urban forestry, welding technician, packaging science, acoustics, archaeology, probably not a big job creator. Management science, actuarial science, air conditioning technician. So they're kind of struggling with this. It's a problem for me as a sociologist. They don't include sociology. They do include something called quantitative economics. So you've got to do a certain amount of math, I guess, with your economics to qualify as STEM. Now, another way of approaching it, and this is the National Science Foundation approach, is to identify specific occupations. So this is from a survey that they have, and this is kind of the way a lot of us think about it. biological, agricultural, and environmental life scientists, and they break it down: biochemists and biophysicists, biological scientists, conservation scientists. So they do it in terms of the old-fashioned way, in terms of occupation. Now, a third way of getting at it, and this is also from the National Science Foundation, from one of their surveys, this captures the kind of algorithm-using marketers that exist today. It's a survey question where they say, do the duties on your job require the technical expertise of a bachelor's degree or higher in engineering, computer science, math, or the natural sciences? So if they say yes on this, that means that even if they're doing sales, but they're selling technical stuff and they use their technical skills on the job, they will count as STEM. And this is a distinction with a huge difference. What I'm about to show you is some data that I put together with my colleague Kevin Lewis. We're working on a book on this. This is basically the story here. If you use the NSF occupation definition, that is the title of your job, fully 62% of those Americans with STEM degrees are not working in STEM. They're diverting out into other kinds of occupations. On the other hand, if you just say, I don't care what your job title is, do you use technical scientific expertise on your job, then only 28% are diverting out, right? And this, I think, is the strongest argument for this kind of STEM-ification of the labor markets. These people are doing jobs that we normally wouldn't think of as STEM, but these jobs are becoming more scientific, more based on technology. Let's look at some specific kinds of degrees here. Computer and information sciences, if we just look at the occupational definition, the NSF occupational definition, almost half of those folks are leaving STEM. Red means they're not doing a STEM job. Vast majority of the biological scientists are not doing STEM jobs. Mechanical engineering, about 50-50. If we use that expertise definition, again, we don't care what your title is, but do you use technical science kind of knowledge on your job? Then you can see the blue means you're still doing something STEM. That means that the scientists are still in a STEM kind of job. Biological sciences also not to the same degree, mechanical as well. So this suggests that jobs are becoming more technological, more based on science. And these old job titles isn't really the way to understand the workforce. This is just another way of looking at it, showing retention in STEM based on these different definitions. All right, so what are the non-STEM jobs that the STEM degree holders are doing? Non-STEM jobs being defined in the NSF occupational title way of looking at it. Generally, generally the short answer is that they're doing a lot of different things. We looked at all of them, and they're spread out all over the labor markets. But there's a pattern that they're moving into more high-paying jobs. And by more high-paying jobs, what I'm saying is, this is Anthony Carnevale's work, what we're seeing is they're moving to jobs where they make more money than they would if they were just a computer scientist, a biological scientist, or a mechanical engineer. Computer science majors not working in STEM jobs, 20% of them are in management. A lot of them go into finance and administrative jobs. Mechanical engineering majors, similar story. They go into management. Apparently, a lot of them still using their technical expertise, marketing and sales. And the biology majors go into medicine. They practice medicine. Not officially a STEM job, according to any of the government ways of identifying jobs. All right. So the next three stories I'm going to tell you are about how the businesses themselves are kind of creating this problem of a crisis of STEM workers. And one of them is that they're not providing training like they used to. They're pulling back from training their own workers. This means that they're saying that there's a skills gap, but they're asking the public sector to take on the burden, or individuals themselves to train themselves to take these jobs. Again, this is work I'm doing with my colleague Kevin Lewis. I'm calling this the dark side of innovation. We all love the new iPhone. We all love the latest version of the Android phone. We love new technologies with video and virtual reality. The problem is if you work in those industries, you risk your job skills becoming obsolescent and losing your relevance to the labor market. Only about a third of STEM workers, according to National Science Foundation surveys, report that they are doing training to improve skills. That's using the expertise definition of STEM worker. And employees for for-profit firms are the least likely to say that they're doing skills-related training. Really been declining slightly since the 1990s. There's no evidence that firms are making special efforts to train underutilized populations, Latinos, African Americans, women, mothers, older workers. And there's also work by Steve Barley and others has shown that the pressure of having to self-teach skills creates work and family conflict. It means you're working on the job and you're also spending your evenings trying to teach yourself stuff. All right, story 3B, self-inflicted crisis. Firms actually pay kind of low wages for STEM workers. We all know that STEM workers make high wages out of the box. You know, they start off high and it looks great. But there's really not much of a rise since the late 1990s, controlling for inflation. And work by Hal Salzman, a public policy scholar at Rutgers, has nicely shown that some fields like petroleum engineering, they've really raised wages. They did a lot, and American workers responded. They started majoring in petroleum engineering, and they started to fill that skills gap. They responded to the salary increases, but we don't see so much of that in software and IT. Salary, the wages have really kind of been stagnant, according to Hal Salzman. You got these non-compete agreements. California bans these things, but you may have heard about the story of this kind of secret agreement that Apple, Google, and other Silicon Valley firms had, where they agreed not to poach each other's employees. They settled with the government for $415 million. That was an effort to keep salaries down of STEM workers. About 8%, according to NSF surveys, 8% of STEM degree holders involuntarily leave the field because of wages or they can't find a job. STEM workers really, they tend to leave voluntarily for higher wages. They can make more money in management, make more money as a physician in medical jobs, as an intellectual property lawyer rather than someone who generates intellectual property, they can make more money. Then the last story we have here of this kind of self-inflicted crisis, it has to do with the management of these workers. Research by Peter Capelli, a management scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, has nicely shown that a lot of these STEM jobs stay open due to managerial ignorance of what the jobs actually entail. And so what happens is the managers don't really know what the technical jobs are. When they feel like they need some certain skills, they put a whole list of them in the job ad. And the job ads then don't really have any relationship to what kinds of skills people typically have. Everyone in this room has a set of skills, and they kind of fit together in some way. We have this problem, according to Capelli and some other researchers, that these job ads end up looking for what they call purple unicorns, this amazing person who can fulfill all these different tasks at a particular job. The job then stays open for months and months and months, and then they say, hey, we can't fill this job. There's a skills gap. You know, there's a problem here. And actually, it's them having unrealistic ideas of what kind of workers are out there. Another big problem is that the innovative firms are chasing the 90th percentile. They're chasing the very best workers. When I talk to software developing firms and the kind of problems they have finding workers, this is what they typically will say. They'll say it's hard to find the really good developers. There's a lot of okay ones, there's a lot of mediocre ones, but we want really good ones. Ones who can code, but who also understand abstract thinking, who understand seeing the big picture as well as the details, are willing to take risks. They want all this stuff together in these super talented, highly skilled developers, and they're all chasing these folks. And so, when they can't find them, they think there's a shortage. And I'm sympathetic to this argument. There's this saying among software developer firms that like one really good developer is worth 20 mediocre developers. Sometimes they'll say that if you add a developer who's not that good, it actually slows down the whole project. They write some lousy code, and then everyone has to spend time trying to find that lousy code. So this is a real issue, and I think it breeds the sense of an overall STEM crisis. A lot of research shows that working in these jobs is extremely high pressure. Product cycles are really quick. Innovation is fast, and they end up having to work extremely long hours. Martinez is the guy who used to work at Facebook, who wrote this big tell-all book about it. He talks about working on Sundays and trying to compete with Google all the time. Short job ladders. There's not much room for promotion. The salary incentives, kind of pull people into management. There's a boom and bust process stuff. You may have heard Microsoft just laid off a bunch of people. That's because cloud computing is the new huge thing. And so Microsoft got rid of a bunch of their workers who don't help their cloud computing, and they're hiring. There's a big boom now in expertise in cloud computing. Layoff.com. I just found out about this because a buddy of mine, known him since kindergarten, a senior engineer for a major industrial firm, might be called GE. You may have heard of it. Started by Thomas Edison many years ago. He just got laid off, and turns out that some activist investors wanted to raise the dividend, and so GE had to cut $2 billion from its expensive. He's 51 years old. He's out of a job, and he told me about this website called thelayoff.com, and I went to look at it, and it's all these workers filled with stress. They're thinking, oh my God, our stock price has plummeted. Am I going to be next? And I was interested to see, at least the day I looked at it, on the homepage of this website, they list the major companies where there's a lot of chatter about layoffs. And a lot of them are tech firms. Intel, IBM, Cisco, Oracle were all there. Seagate was another one. We're all there the day that I looked at it. And again, back to the story about diversity. Tech firms say that there's a shortage of workers, but they've really done a poor job of recruiting women, of recruiting Latinos, of recruiting African Americans, older workers as well. All right. So big takeaway point. When you hear this stuff about STEM workforce, we need more, get them in the pipeline, don't want to have a leaky pipeline, we got to bring them out there, be skeptical of this. Each of these stories, I think, has some truth to it. But be skeptical of these, the more the better arguments. Be skeptical of arguments about we need so many STEM workers when we're not even sure what exactly STEM is and what the education level is. I want to make the argument that employers need STEM skills, but not necessarily STEM workers. That is, people can have some basic ideas of coding. They can have some, they know math. They have quantitative reasoning. They don't necessarily need a math degree. We don't need more mathematicians. We need people with math skills. These are very different kinds of things. You can major in history or English or sociology, but learn the quantitative skills as well. The primary demand, when you hear STEM, it's really misleading. It turns out about 50% of STEM workers who are doing STEM jobs are actually in computers and software. That's half of all the STEM workers. That is where most of the demand seems to be. They don't really need the urban foresters, and even biotech is an important wealth generator, but doesn't have a huge amount of jobs. I wanted to add something here that surveys show employers what they really want are not just STEM skills, but they really want students with degrees, and I'm looking at students here, people who can communicate. This is what the surveys show. They want communication skills. They want teamwork skills. I always have my students do group projects. I know students hate it, but it's good for you guys to be able to know how to work in groups. Problem solving, critical thinking, these kind of what UCSD alum Vivian Ming calls metacognitions. These kinds of basic kind of metacognitions allows you to plug into a lot of different jobs and adapt as technology changes your job. And I also want to make the argument that firms are contributing to their own problems. They need to do more training. If they want technical workers, they should pay them more and maybe pay the managers a little bit less. And they do need to do a little bit more to pursue women, minorities, older workers, mothers, those kinds of things to solve their own perceived skills gap. And thank you.